is to our country. We have a very proactive Minister of Labor who has been given a mandate to bring in anti-scab legislation. This is the type of legislation that I have talked about for many years, Mr. Speaker. It's the type of legislation that you will find that the Minister of Labor has been talking about for a long time also. It's the type of legislation that when we were in opposition, we often heard private members' bills coming from the Conservative Party in which we were in opposition to because they were anti-union organizing pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, it would appear, based on second reading and what I've been hearing from other members of the chamber, there is a very good chance that this legislation will pass unanimously, Mr. Speaker. And I really and truly hope that it does, because I think it says a very powerful message to all Canadians in terms of the important role that unions play in today's society, the importance of having labor harmony in Canada, and how this legislation can have a positive impact, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage members to take a look at, for example, anti-replacement workers or anti-scab legislation that was really first brought in the province of Quebec. And then the following province that brought it in would have been British Columbia. And you will find that I would ultimately argue, and many others inside this chamber no doubt would add their voice to it, that through that legislation, what we saw was more harmony in the workforce. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the type of legislation that's being proposed in expectation that it will receive widespread support is something that's really encouraging. And it's something that we should not be taking for granted. Because as a political issue, as I say, it's been with me for many years. And if I can just reflect on that for a bit, Mr. Speaker, just to give people a sense in terms of just how controversial it could be. In my home province of Manitoba, and Manitoba is an important part of Canada's labor history. And maybe before I go on to my specific case, just so that people that are following the debate today will realize that labor history in Canada is actually, I would suggest to you, one of the most major protests that we saw at the very beginning would have been with George Brown, who was the founder of the Globe and Mail, as someone that organized or played an important role in terms of a printing press people, Mr. Speaker, where there was a significant rally in front of the Toronto legislature. But fast forward it to the one I often talk about, and that is the Winnipeg General 1919 strike, which is embedded in the minds of many, Mr. Speaker, even non-union members. I often will look at the Free Press, where one of the pages and pictures that they continuously reprint is the trolley car that was turned over during the 1919 strike, the Bloody Saturday, and the impact that has had on the labor movement here in Canada. In fact, on the 100th anniversary of the 1919 general strike, we contributed as a House of Commons to the trolley, a replica, and it being put in just outside of Pantages or just across the street from City Hall, so that people that are walking by get a sense in terms of what had taken place, because it stands out there and you have to wonder, why is that there? And it's connected to something that the Free Press publishes, as I say, on a regular basis, that trolley car. It's very symbolic for the city of Winnipeg, and I would suggest to you, even our country. Because through that strike that had taken place, and through organized labor at the time, the area in which I represent, the Ukrainian labor temple, Mr. Speaker, which is on in the north end of Winnipeg, the traditional north end of Winnipeg, on McCrager, Mr. Speaker, you will see that the organizers would often be in different areas, in particular in the north end of Winnipeg, organizing that strike. And what we found is that even though there was some low points where workers were hurt, maimed, and killed, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, what I took away from that particular strike was that labor was not just concerned about the working conditions that people found themselves in. From my perspective, it took on a social movement of sorts, where it wasn't just about working X number of hours and how much money that we're getting paid. It was about the way of life and how people, in particular people with smaller incomes amount, Mr. Speaker, were being exploited, taken advantage of. And that there was a role for unions at the time, not only to advocate for those wages and working conditions, but often reflected on social programming. So when I take a look at Winnipeg, I think it's a good example in terms of what had taken place and the labor movement ever since, Mr. Speaker. And in 1988, when I was first elected, we had this thing called final offer selection. And at the time, it was being debated. You had the Conservative Party, Progressive Conservative Party, that opposed the legislation, and you had the NDP who supported the legislation, but were not prepared to accept any sort of amendments to the legislation. At the time, we were the official opposition in the Liberal Party, and for us, we wanted to maintain the legislation, and we were prepared to accept an amendment if, in fact, the Conservatives would allow the legislation to survive. Well, we sat for many hours, late into the evening, on committees, heard from many different unions on a wide spectrum of issues. And it was something that was actually fought for to get the final offer selection. It was a compromise. Final offer selection was brought in by Howard Pawley, NDP Premier, as a compromise. You see, because in the election prior, Howard Pawley had actually promised to bring in anti-scab legislation. So Manitoba was going to have anti-scab legislation, but because of the resistance, the NDP at the time decided not to bring in replacement worker legislation, but as a compromise brought in the final offer selection. And in the first 2 years as a parliamentarian, in a minority situation, I can tell you that it was an extensive debate that had taken place. So it's kind of like a crash course on the importance of labor, listening to so many representatives from labor and from management, Mr. Speaker, and other stakeholders that came there. And literally sitting through all sorts of hours and hours of committees to the debates that had taken place. Sadly, final offer selection was killed. And it was, I would ultimately argue, prematurely killed because the political parties collectively could not see the merit in having final offer selection. And for those of you that don't necessarily understand what final offer selection is it provided the union the opportunity to say that, look, negotiations are not going well. There's a level of untrust that we cannot overcome. And then they would request that final offer selection be implemented. And through final offer selection, then you get this arbitrator who would come in and say to the union and to the management group, give me your best offer. And ultimately, that's what would happen. Both sides would present to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator was not allowed to change anything. The arbitrator had to take one over the other with no modifications. And I think that if one was to review the Hansards of back then, you will find that it was actually fairly effective. It made both union and management come to the table and give it their best shot, and knowing full well that one side was not necessarily going to be overly happy because the other side was going to be chosen. And the argument in part back then is that over time it would in fact work out. And it was used, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that it proved to be effective. But sadly, because there was no consensus that was being achieved between the political parties, the personalities at the time, Mr. Speaker, we ended up losing final offer selection in Manitoba. In my opinion, that set back labor relations and many of the efforts of unions. And then I would reflect over the years, and if you even check, Mr. Speaker, even as a member of Parliament, in previous years as an MP, I've raised the issue of final offer selection. Because that was an opportunity that Manitoba lost because there was no political consensus. Fast forward it to today, where we have a Minister of Labor who has vested so much time and energy with the department and has come forward with a piece of legislation that is ultimately being supported, from what I understand, from all members of the House of Commons. So through the ideas of whether it's the Prime Minister in bringing it in as a part of a platform, to issuing it in the form of a mandate letter, to a caucus that truly understands the importance of labor and how it impacts the Canadian economy and society, we had the support to move forward on this substantive issue. And we quickly found out we expected to receive support from the New Democrats and even the Bloc because of the history of the Bloc in the province of Quebec, Mr. Speaker. But what was pleasantly surprised was that the Conservatives actually supported it going into committee. Now, some of my colleagues might question the motivation for that, but I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. I am going to take it that they actually do support the legislation, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to say that the glass is half full, and it's going to be full because at the end of the day, I really do think it's going to pass with the unanimous support of the House. And I shouldn't take for granted the Green Party. My understanding is that the Green Party, being a progressive party, will hopefully also be endorsing the legislation. I can't recall offhand what it is that the leader of the Green Party has said. I see this, Mr. Speaker, as a positive thing. I think it sends a powerful message, and other provinces should take note of it. I can tell you, my daughter, who's a provincial MLA in the province of Manitoba, shortly after us introducing the legislation, brought it up in Manitoba. And today I can tell you that the province of Manitoba seems to be moving forward on the issue of anti-scab legislation with a huge expectation that we will see that legislation brought into the province of Manitoba. And I think that's a wonderful thing because, you see, the federal legislation only has limitations in terms of who all it impacts. And the ideal situation is that we have provinces throughout the country recognize that not only does the province of Quebec have it and the province of British Columbia, but now we have leadership coming from Ottawa indicating that Ottawa is moving forward, and more important, Mr. Speaker, or just as important, it appears to be moving forward with the support of all political parties. Because when I've had the types of debates, the partisan types of debates in the past, I haven't seen the type of support that this legislation is actually receiving. So I want to personally congratulate the Minister of Labour in particular and his team of individuals that was able to do the consultation that was necessary, the work that's so very important, Mr. Speaker, in achieving a consensus. And that consensus will, in fact, benefit all of us. As not only am I optimistic for the province of Manitoba, but I believe that there are other provinces that are out there that will take note. And whether it's individual members in other legislatures or it's political parties as a whole, recognizing that, my gosh, if Ottawa can pass this kind of legislation, that provincial jurisdictions can too. And we have two provinces that have already done so, Mr. Speaker, that have had it in place for years. And that's why I believe that this is legislation, Mr. Speaker, that can really have a positive outcome for us as a nation. Because it is about labor harmony. And when you talk about building a stronger and healthier economy, when you talk about having a sense of fairness, Mr. Speaker, when you talk about enhancing the middle class, when you talk about investing in solid social programs, whether it's pensionable programs, whether it's health care services, whether it's other programs dealing with issues like seniors, people with disabilities, these are issues that the labor movement has been talking about for many, many years and has contributed in a positive way. You know, we have pharmacare that's on our agenda, and I can recall meeting with union reps to talk about the importance of pharmacare. So I believe, Mr. Speaker, that at the end of the day, that we take advantage of the consensus that I believe is out there here on the floor of the House of Commons. We recognize how this type of legislation is going to help Canada's economy and our society as a whole, Mr. Speaker. I believe it will have a positive impact on labor here in Canada. Now, you're telling me I only have about 30 seconds to go. Mr. Speaker, there's lots of details within the legislation. The Minister of Labour has highlighted it. We've had it go through second reading where that was highlighted. I would require another half hour or so to go through that detail, but I don't want to filibuster the legislation, Mr. Speaker, or ask for a unanimous consent to have the leave to do so. So I'll leave my comments on that positive note. It's great to see members of all political parties unite behind good, solid labor legislation, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
So it's great to start off a morning with the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, and it is refreshing to hear the member from Winnipeg North speak in this House as opposed to one of the many, many other Liberals who are always up speaking instead. Now, I want a couple comments. First of all, he said himself, such an important issue. I've talked about it so many years. The Minister of Labour has talked about it so many years. It's funny how it's so important it's taken them 9 years. I think it's a tiny bit of political opportunism there. But I want to quote from the Canadian Encyclopedia. He talked a lot, as he did previously on C-58, about the Great Strike in 1919. Canadian Encyclopedia says the cause of the strike was inflation costs, housing and food too much to afford. How does a member feel about creating the identical situations in Canada under his government that caused the Great Strike in 1919.
The honourable parliamentary secretary to the government House Leader.
Yes, in the continuation of my speech and the spirit in terms of which the question is being posed, I'm going to keep positive, Mr. Speaker, because I believe that if you take a look at Canada's interest rate or our inflation rate, what you will find in comparison to virtually any other country in the world, in particular, let's say the G7 countries or the G20 countries, Canada is doing exceptionally well. And in fact, our inflation rate now has dropped to 2.7%, and we are on target for the last 4 months. Hopefully, we're going to be able to see that decrease in interest rate. It's important that as a House of Commons, not only should the government be focused on trying to improve the economic conditions, even though we are doing much better than most of our peers, Mr. Speaker, it's still important that we focus our attention on that than a lot of the other more negative aspects of politics that we often witness on the floor of the House of Commons. And by doing that, Mr. Speaker, I think that we're actually helping Canadians. I think that over the next number of months, and hopefully collectively we can come into an agreement that the inflation rate will remain in the direction that it is going, and hopefully we're going to see more relief in regards to interest rates, but we have to respect the independence of the Bank of Canada.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I'm happy that my colleague on the other side of the House sees the glass half full. And if I was on his side, I'd probably try to do the same thing. He also talked about the fact that it was really quick for C-58 with the government action to come through. The first bill was tabled by my colleague from Mégoncourt in 1990. We've had 30 bills since. So also C-75 from my colleague was also tabled, and at the block, as soon as this bill receives royal assent, we'd like it to be implemented. But we couldn't agree. At committee, other members wanted 18 months before it would come into force. So we'd like it to come into force quickly. And with the upcoming election, it kind of endangers the implementation of this legislation. So does he still agree that the glass is half full? How come we can't have it come into force the first day after it receives royal assent? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm thinking in terms of when we first came into government back in 2015 and 2016, if you take a look at some of the substantive measures that we had taken, the first issue was dealing with Canada's middle class and giving them that tax break, and I'm sure the member can recall that, and it was very well received. Other legislations that we did was to take back private members' bills that many had perceived as anti-union bills. That was something that was, again, very well received, in particular by our labor movement. And we have been very much proactive in terms of providing for supports in things such as apprenticeship training, looking at ways in which we can promote and have more harmony within the labor force. And of course, there's always a consultation. Now, you have to factor in that there's also a worldwide pandemic that had to be dealt with. There's all sorts of things. But even having a very busy legislative agenda over the years, the ministers have, in fact, been working with labor in particular, but other stakeholders, and ultimately I think it's great that we have the legislation at the stage that we have it, and let's acknowledge it, and we've built that consensus. Because that we did it right, we now have the type of consensus we have today, and hopefully we'll see it pass through today.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And today is a good day for workers. It's a good day for New Democrats, and it's a good day to make certain that unions can participate in making sure they have powerful paychecks, because powerful paychecks come from powerful unions. Mr. Speaker, this is an incredible success and a testament to workers and their exercising of rights across the country. It's immensely disappointing, though, to know that both the Liberals and Conservatives, when New Democrats tabled this bill 15 times, they voted against. Mr. Speaker, it's incredibly important that we acknowledge the hard work of the unions who've been pushing this for generations now. I'm proud to be part of a party that forced this government to bring this legislation to a vote. I'm proud to be part of a party that's going to ensure that unions actually have the power to make sure that their material conditions are improved. Mr. Speaker, why has it taken the Liberals so long to participate in making sure that unions are more powerful?
The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, it's really encouraging to recognize that for the first time we have a very much a progressive Prime Minister that understands and appreciates the importance of supporting Canadians and Labour. And you know, we haven't been in, this Prime Minister has not been in government for 15 years. I can understand the frustration. You know, because, you know, as I made reference to Howard Pauley's promise of anti-scab legislation many, many years ago, well over 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, we could have had final offer selection. And we've been waiting for the longest time for that. But because we now have the federal legislation, because members of all political parties are likely going to be supporting it, Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, is likely going to be getting anti-scab legislation. In other words, let's not necessarily look at patting, and even though some might say I've been patting on the back too, but let's put the union worker and the workers across Canada, even non-union workers. Let's recognize the many contributions Labour has had that goes far beyond just the working environment and wages and so forth. Think in terms of the social programs that have here today and the contributions that the Labour movement has had in making those become often a reality, and the endless lobbying they do. And I do thank the New Democrats and others that participated in making today possible.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the trade union movement has played a key role over a period of, I think, more than 1.5 centuries in improving the working life of the workers. I think the trade union movement has ensured that as the countries industrialized, as the countries developed, the standard of living of all the people in the society is good because of the agreements that they were able to strike with the employers. This legislation affects the federally regulated industry with over 22,000 employers and about 1 million employees. I'm glad the member talked about his experience in Manitoba when the final offer selection could not go through. And he is right in one way that while it gives benefit to 1 million employees in the federally regulated sector, much more responsibility is with the provinces. I would like to ask him his opinion on or his suggestions on how we can influence provinces to take measures in the same way that now the federal government is moving.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I think the most important thing is that the federal government has recognized that anti-scab legislation is good legislation, and the reason why we've brought it forward, because it's good for Canada. It's good for our economy. It's good for the workers. What's good for the workers is good for Canada. And so that's the most important thing. The second thing that Ottawa can do is doing what we're doing today. We've now appeared to have a consensus where all political entities in the House are going to be voting in favor of that. To me, that sends a very powerful message to all the different provinces. The reason why I brought up the Manitoba situation is it was because of political partisanship that Manitoba never got anti-scab legislation. It was because of political partisanship that final offer selection was killed. Here today, we are demonstrating that if you put the political partisanship aside, good legislation can pass for the betterment of our country and our workers.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to rise on behalf of the residents of Kelowna Lake Country. I rise today to speak on Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board regulations. This legislation passed at second reading with support of the Conservatives and was recently scrutinized at the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, termed the Human Resources Committee, where I'm proud to serve as Vice Chair on behalf of the Conservative Caucus. I'd like to thank all Conservative members, but in particular the Conservative member for Dufferin-Caledon for his work on this legislation and for attending our committee meetings on this. The Human Resources Committee heard from a wide variety of relevant witnesses to this legislation and to the issue of replacement workers at large. The committee heard from many labor representatives and business industry stakeholders. We also heard testimony from the Canada Industrial Relations Board, whose work will be affected by this legislation. From my observations, there seemed to be a lot of interest from all parties to ask questions and to delve into the work they do and how this legislation could potentially affect their workload and operations. For myself, I had a much better understanding of their internal processes once they had answered all of our questions. Many witnesses at committee spoke of the importance of the board. It is the federal government that has the responsibility for this National Canadian Industrial Relations Board. And while the legislation before us intends to encourage faster decision-making at the board, ultimately it is on the Liberal government to ensure it is properly operating to resolve labor conflicts that come before it and to meet the needs of those involved. Representatives of both employers and labor said that the Canada Industrial Relations Board needs to be operating faster now and moving forward. And in fact, an amendment at committee, which is now in this legislation, reduced the number of days the Canadian Industrial Relations Board is required to render decisions. One other point I'll note in this legislation is there was an amendment at committee, supported by all members, to move up the coming into force date for this legislation. I'd like to bring to the House some of the important feedback we heard from various stakeholder witnesses on C-58. Several points were raised during the committee study of this legislation. While the Liberals may trumpet this legislation as focusing on replacement workers, they themselves have been replacing workers in government workplaces with Liberal-friendly external contractors. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that this government has spent more on expensive external outsourced contractors than ever before. We know this affects workers in many ways. For example, the president of the Customs and Immigrations Union appeared before the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. He said that when it came to the role of the disastrous $60 million ArriveCan app, quote, "We believe the goal of the app is to replace officers," unquote. He spoke on how he believes that had his workers been listened to during the ArriveCan process, instead of being replaced by a two-person IT firm at the cost of $60 million to taxpayers, then, quote, "a great deal of what happened would not have happened," unquote. At the Human Resources Committee study of C-58, we heard from labor representatives how outsourced contractors and consultants were a concern for their workers. Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government says it stands on the side of labor, yet actively sidelines its hard-working public service workers and, worse yet, replaces their work with expensive, outsourced consultants and contractors at the cost of billions to taxpayers. We also heard from labor representatives that outside consultants and contractors can be demoralizing for their workers when someone has been hired from outside as an external contractor to oversee these duties or do the same duties. So again, the Liberals say they have hired, the Liberals have hired a lot of public sector workers during their time in government. These workers surely have needed experience and expertise, but then behind closed doors, the Liberals choose to not trust them with major government initiatives and instead replace their work with high-priced, Liberal-friendly contractors and consultants at the cost of billions of dollars to Canadian taxpayers. One of the things Bill C-58 does is to amend the maintenance of activities process to, quote, encourage employers and trade unions to reach an earlier agreement respecting activities to be maintained in the event of a legal strike or lockout, unquote. Our committee heard from many stakeholders on the types of implementations that typically arise when identifying these essential activities. One of the challenges identified was what qualifies as work that is in the national interest, public safety, or critical infrastructure. While these may be easy to identify as essential activities in some workplaces, we heard of some challenges of identifying essential activities in often limited windows of time. Lastly, while I spoke earlier about the concerning trend of this Liberal government endorsing replacement work through outside contractors and consultants inside the government, I'd also like to speak to the government's record of replacing Canadian workers with international workers as part of multi-billion-dollar agreements with major corporations. When this Liberal government signed agreements that provided $44 billion in taxpayer money to massively profitable corporations in exchange for building electric battery plants in Ontario, they promised it would create Canadian jobs. When Conservatives pointed out that these plants would be built with international labor instead of Canadian labor, both the Liberal Employment Minister and Liberal Industry Minister tried to downplay the number, saying it would only be a small handful. Well, Conservatives didn't believe them, and neither did Canada's building trades unions. They wrote a letter to the Prime Minister outlining how foreign workers are displacing Canadian labourers at the Nexstar construction site, all the while 180 local millwrights and ironworkers were unemployed and available to perform the necessary work. To quote the Canadian Building Trades Union president in his letter to the Prime Minister, quote, Canadian workers are now being replaced by international workers at an increasing pace on work that was previously assigned to Canadian workers, unquote. Replaced. The Liberal ministers also weren't truthful when they said this was only a short-term issue that required foreign replacement workers who had, quote, specialized knowledge, unquote. As the letter from Canadian Building Trades Union points out, quote, this is the brazen displacement of Canadian workers in favor of international workers by major international corporations thumbing their noses at both the Government of Canada, taxpayers, and our skilled trades workers, unquote. Now, the Liberals say they want to ban replacement workers, yet they've allowed Canadian workers to be replaced in favor of the demands of internationally profitable organizations. During the Labour Minister's appearance at committee on C-58, we asked him why he hadn't demanded a memorandum as part of the deal to guarantee hiring Canadian contractors for the Stellantis plant. The minister said he did not view this as his role and that it was a matter of provincial jurisdiction, even though potential foreign workers coming to Canada is a federal responsibility. Workers can't trust these words or the promises of more jobs supposedly outlined in these agreements with Stellantis or other deals. If the Liberals wanted to regain their trust, they should simply make the commitment for Canadian jobs outlined in these agreements public, but they refuse to do so. At other committees, Conservative members tried to get access to the contracts. However, Liberal and NDP members filibustered to protect the government and prevent workers, from hearing the truth. Now, in addition, Conservatives were pushing this Liberal government to release details of its agreement with Honda Canada on building their electric vehicle operation in Ontario, to have disclosure which is necessary to ensure Canadians get all the jobs in this multi-billion-dollar project. Now, yes, the NDP, the party that calls itself a friend of workers, are joining with the Liberals in hiding contracts from Canadian workers and the Canadian public. One of the other things I'll bring up just with respect to workers is with respect to the just transition legislation, which has been renamed. And we know that an internal government document disclosed that there would be 2.7 million workers who would be affected by the legislation. There is a lot of uncertainty with this. There is a lot of concern by what this means, and it is creating a lot of stress for workers in the country, particularly those in the energy sector. In this lengthy government document, it does outline some other potential jobs. However, they are nowhere near at the same level that you would consider for pay and for benefits. So there is a lot of concern by workers in this country, and legislation like that certainly does not put people's mind at ease. It's one of the great privileges of my role as Shadow Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion to travel this country and speak to many workers. And the input that I've had from them has really been very, very meaningful to hear what a lot of their issues are and what a lot of their suggestions are. And I do appreciate those conversations. So, Mr. Speaker, Conservatives have been supporting this legislation along the way and continue to, though it is clear that this legislation before us today alone will not resolve all of the issues of workers being replaced in many different ways. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his speech. I commend the Conservatives' approach to supporting this bill, protecting the fundamental right of the workers and recognizing the important work the trade unions do in improving the workplace, healthy workplace and the safety of the employees. I would like to ask a comment on this issue that federally regulated industries that is covered in this bill affects about 22,000 employers and about 1 million employees. However, bulk of the working class population in Canada are working in industries and sectors that are provincially managed. What is their suggestion on how we can influence the provinces to adopt the objectives of this bill so that every Canadian worker will get the same benefit?
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. We are here today debating Bill C-58. This is in the final stages in this House, and what I can say is just referencing this specific bill, which is for federally regulated workers. It has gone through all of the processes. We did have a number of amendments. I didn't speak to all of the amendments here today just due to time, but we did have a number of amendments that did come through committee that were approved of and are now in this legislation. And so we look forward to moving forward with this legislation so that it can move into the next stages in the parliamentary process.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, workers at Cascadia Liquor in Victoria and across Vancouver Island are on strike for fair wages. Now, Cascadia Liquor faces a legal complaint for breaking BC law by bringing in replacement workers. New Democrats have been fighting for federal anti-scab legislation for decades, but the truth is, the Conservatives and the Liberals voted against it. Most recently, in 2016, when the NDP brought it forward, but it's been dozens of times. Conservatives pretend that they support workers, but you won't see them on a picket line. New Democrats will keep fighting for workers. I joined Cascadia workers on the picket line last week, and I will continue to stand in solidarity with them because powerful paychecks come from powerful unions.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that was a statement as opposed to a question. So all I'll say is that we have Bill C-58 before us here today. As I mentioned, we have been working this legislation through the parliamentary processes. We had very good testimony at committee. We had some recommendations that were approved of through amendments, and here we are today at this stage, and that's what we're debating here today. And as I mentioned, Conservatives are supportive of the amended legislation before us.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard a lot from the illiterate Liberal economic policy on the other side with regard to this and other things. And one of the things I find fascinating is that they speak out of one side but do the other in terms of their position. So while they express themselves about this bill, they allow foreign replacement workers at the Stellantis plant in Windsor, but they're so afraid to prove that they protected Canadian jobs, which clearly they haven't since we have these foreign replacement workers, that they won't release the contracts and prove us wrong. I've read the contracts. So I'd like to ask the member what her view is on foreign replacement workers in relation to this bill.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Absolutely, this is a concern, and I outlined in some of my intervention here how we did bring this up at committee, and unfortunately the minister was very vague. We know that the information that they had given initially on this was that, it's a very small handful of people, and we found out that that is factually incorrect. It is very concerning, and if the government doesn't have anything to hide, then they should absolutely disclose what the arrangements are.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my neighbour in Kelowna Lake Country for her speech. I just want to point out that so many times I hear Conservatives bring up criticisms of anti-scab legislation, saying it will extend, delay, make these labour disputes longer and longer, when in fact it's the labour disputes when replacement workers are brought in that become dangerous, become vicious, and become very, very long and tear communities apart. I think of the giant mine in Yellowknife where 9 people were killed by people so frustrated that they have been replaced and had no choice. I'm just wondering if she could comment on the fact that anti-scab legislation is actually good for bringing people together, for making, giving workers their right to remove their labor when they feel that they need to put pressure on management to get fair wages and good working conditions. And that's the only power they have.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. What I can speak to is that what is before us today is Bill C-58, and that is the legislation that is before us. We have had healthy debate in this House of Commons over this legislation. We had a lot of testimony at committee, and it went through all of its processes there. We had some amendments that made the legislation even better than it was before. I outlined a couple of them in my intervention. And so here we are today with this legislation, which does affect federally regulated industries. And as I mentioned, we have been supportive of this legislation and working towards making it better. And in particular, with the Labor Board, it was, as I mentioned in my intervention, it was good to hear from them and get a lot of our questions answered as to their internal operations, so that we could better understand how they deal with the different applications that come forth, and what they're going to do moving forward in order to improve their processing times. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Je n'en vois pas. The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And, I have a simple question, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Conservatives were playing many games in committee to try to prolong the vote on this legislation, and I just want to understand more clearly why the Conservatives haven't supported this the years and years and years that the NDP have tried to move it forward. Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member sits with me at committee. I'm unclear what she's referencing because we had set committee days on that were set for to hear from witnesses on this. We had clause by clause. There was absolutely no delays. I'm really not sure what she's referencing. We asked witnesses questions. We had clause by clause that went very expeditiously, and I'm really unclear what she's even referencing. I think she's trying to create a story that's not there.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll stay away from the members' comments that clearly demonstrate the Conservatives' opposition to Stellantis and to Volkswagen and to Honda. I understand they don't support the federal government bringing those companies to Canada. But what confuses me is I'm not sure if the member fully understands a replacement worker anti-scab legislation. That means you have a company that's in existence in Canada, and they go on, there's a strike that takes place, that the company would not be able to bring in replacement workers. That's what we're actually talking about when it comes to replacement workers. And I just want the member to give confirmation that that is, in fact, her understanding also.
Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the comment from the member for his concern over me being informed. Of course, I have read the legislation. I sit on the committee that dealt with it clause by clause, so very involved in this legislation. I clearly gave examples of other ways that workers can be replaced, whether it's through external contractors and consultants, as I outlined in my intervention, or whether it's from foreign replacement workers, and that is a term that was actually used by building trades in their letter to the Prime Minister. So there are other ways I was referencing that replacement workers can affect workers. It is a way of replacing workers, although in fact the legislation it is a very specific way of deeming it. But there are other ways that workers can be replaced, and that's what I was referencing in my intervention. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question Kamaltar, the honourable member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives, I find it comedic in some ways that they now, at this final hour when this bill's been tabled 8 times, are likely to vote in favor because they know New Democrats have forced the vote on this.
That's right.
And they know that it's going to pass.
That's right.
And so I find it comedic that now they're trying to play as if they've never seen this bill ever before. It's been tabled 8 times in this House. They failed to vote for it 8 times, Mr. Speaker. Right. What explanation can that member give to why they voted against it so many times?
That's right.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what I find comedic is actually the NDP member not acknowledging that he's actually part of the government. He's in a coalition with the government, and this coalition agreement. And he's chirping me right now. He won't even allow me to actually answer the question. So this is the trend from this particular member, and it's unbelievable that this member is in a coalition and yet actually is asking that type of question. As I referenced, we have Bill C-58 in front of us. That's what we're debating here today. That's what we're going to be voting on soon, and that's what's before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For a quick interaction, the honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
There have been some interesting interventions from the Liberals, the NDP Liberals, but they know about an inch deep on a lot of issues. So let me provide a little more color and give the member an opportunity to do this on the particular issue of foreign replacement workers and Stellantis. The Canadian Building and Trades Council, a union, has condemned this government for their use of foreign replacement workers for non-proprietary jobs at Stellantis, things like forklift drivers. They've got over 138 members sitting at home unemployed in Windsor, while this government allows Stellantis to bring in over 900 construction workers, most of them in non-proprietary issues. So I'd like to have the member comment on why it is she thinks that this government talks out of one side of their mouth when they're in the chamber on legislation, but when they're administering the law, actually does the opposite.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Well, this government does have quite a trend of doing great photo ops and, lots of announcements, but their follow-through really isn't great. I mean, they time and time again, we see that from this government. And, I do have here the letter that was sent by the Canada's Building Trades Union, and it's very to the point to the Prime Minister of their concerns. And their concerns have not been eliminated. Their concerns have not been addressed. And this government continues to deflect and be evasive on this issue. They're not being transparent. As I mentioned, a number of my colleagues at different committees, and including at our committee, had tried to get information on the contracts in order to protect workers. And if the government really had nothing to hide, then why would they not be disclosing these contracts?
Well done.
Statements by members. Déclaration de député. L'honorable député de Nepean.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Speaker, recently I was pleased to attend the opening of Hollier House, an affordable housing structure which has funding of $2.72 million from the federal government. Hollier House is a new 4-story, 35-unit mixed-use apartment building in Ottawa's West End, the Bells Corners neighborhood. The building also is home to a community health and resource center, or the Western Ottawa Community Resource Center, and FAMSAC food cupboard. The federal government funded $100,000 for the community room located in Hollier House. Thanks to Anglican Diocese of Ottawa and the Christchurch Bells Corners for making this possible. This is an excellent example where our federal government has partnered with a willing organization to meet the mutually shared objective of addressing affordable housing and other needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saskatoon Grasswoods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate my member of the Legislative Assembly in Saskatchewan, Don Morgan, on his retirement coming up this fall. Don graduated from the University of Saskatchewan College of Law in 1978. Between 1988 and 1992, he was chair and CEO of Saskatchewan Legal Aid Commission and was appointed as King's Counsel in 1990. Don was first elected to the Legislative Assembly in November of 2003 for the Sask Party and has served ever since. He had a number of portfolios: Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Minister of Education, Minister of Advanced Education, and many more. Don served his constituents of Saskatoon Southeast faithfully, and he will be deeply missed. Congratulations, Don, on your upcoming retirement. It's well deserved.
The honourable member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Canadians, we join in the celebration of Africa Day with immense respect and admiration for the continent's rich history, cultural diversity, and remarkable achievements. Africa Day is a powerful reminder of the enduring ties between Canada and Africa. These ties are rooted in the shared values of democracy, human rights, and sustainable development. The riding of Milton is fortunate to have a beautiful, diverse, growing African community. It is a vibrant community which reminds us of the beauty of life and values of the African continent. I have had the honor of visiting many places in Africa: Morocco, Egypt, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mali, Liberia, and Benin. I have also climbed Kilimanjaro twice to raise money for NGOs like Right to Play and WaterAid, and I look forward to visiting the great continent of Africa once again. Let us celebrate Africa Day and continue to work towards peace, prosperity, and solidarity, both at home and abroad. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to three great Canadians who recently passed away. Jerome Abraham struggled with addiction for many years before entering the recovery program at Discovery House in Penticton. After treatment, he went on to lead Discovery House through a period of dramatic growth helping so many men get their lives back and return to their families. We lost Jerome to cancer earlier this spring, but will always be inspired by his legacy. Laura Savinkoff was the center, the heart of a very active peace community based in Grand Forks. I last saw Laura at a workshop she organized to discuss the horrific situation in Gaza. She died suddenly 2 weeks later, gone too soon, but we will remember her spirit. Finally, I want to mention the passing of Dr. Bruce Falls, a noted scientist and humble champion of nature conservation in Canada. Bruce died last month at the age of 100 after a lifetime of inspiring service to his country.
The honourable member for Sydney Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, our love of music brings us together as Canadians, but it's tough for our working musicians right now. This week, I spoke to Juno-winning musicians who spoke to the struggles of being a musician because of anti-competitive ticketing companies. Thankfully, the United States Justice Department has moved forward on an antitrust lawsuit against Ticketmaster and Live Nation Entertainment for their anti-competitive practices. With this monopoly, it's hard for Canadians fans to support our local musicians and venues. Our world-class artists deserve full crowds and vibrant local venues. Our government has strengthened the powers of the Competition Bureau, invested historic amounts in arts and culture, including the Canada Music Fund, and supported live events through the boosted Canada Arts Presentation Fund. Mr. Speaker, let's even the playing field so that the working recording artists and musicians that create the music can thrive rather than ticketing monopolies that squeeze our hardworking musicians.
The honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 80 years ago this week, the brave soldiers of the Perth Regiment were fighting in the Casino region of Italy. On May 26, 1944, shortly after the Hitler line was breached, the Perth Regiment moved into the Leary Valley where they were heavily shelled by the enemy. But the brave fighting Perths advanced forward. Over the next several days, they crossed the Leary River and liberated the town of Cipriano and moved forward to Armanara. Several Canadian heroes made the ultimate sacrifice. Among them were Corporal John McRobb of St. Mary's and Private William Simpson and Private Jack Bailey, both of Stratford. Private Wilfred Scott of Cromarty, who was serving with the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, also lost his life in that battle. Days later, the world's attention would turn to D-Day, but we must never forget the courage of those who fought and those who fell in the Italian campaign. Mr. Speaker, we will remember them.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Yukon.
Illegitimus non carborundum. That was the defiant motto of the White Horse Star, Mr. Speaker, a paper which this week published its last edition after serving the Yukon for 124 years. First published from a tent, the White Horse Star is a living record of the Yukon's colourful history. Fire and flood, disasters, royal visits and funerals, elections at all levels, First Nations signing of modern treaties, plane crashes, even Whitehorse's own dramatic events on September 11th, 2001. Further back is the story of the Dawson City Nuggets and their intrepid journey to Ottawa in 1905 to challenge for the Stanley Cup. In more modern times, it seemed not a single event occurred where the Star was not there to capture the scene with photos or a story. The Star was local news at its best, connecting Yukoners from the local to national and international events and personages. This Star has set, but local news must go on. Thank you to the many dedicated staff who made the White Horse Star come alive day after day. Illegitimus non carborundum. Don't let them grind you down, Mr. Speaker.
Congratulations. The honourable member for Burlington, we'll try that again. Oakville, North Burlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada came to Oakville last week when the Junior A Hockey National Championship was hosted at 16 Mile Arena by the town of Oakville and the Oakville Blades. Players and fans from across Canada came out to see their favourite teams battle it out for the 2024 Centennial Cup. The tournament significantly benefited Oakville's thriving economy, bringing in more than $5 million in economic benefit. I attended the thrilling final game when the Collingwood Blues beat the Melfort Mustangs 1-0 to win the 2024 Centennial Cup. Congratulations to Collingwood on their national championship win, and to the Calgary Canucks' Julian Gervais, who won the tournament Most Valuable Player. 16 Mile Arena is the only venue in Canada that has hosted major national events for Hockey Canada, Skate Canada, and Curling Canada. Huge thanks to Todd Carey, manager of 16 Mile Sports Complex, Jamie Angus, and the team for another successful event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. The latest Salvation Army report reveals alarming statistics. 68% of Canadians now rely on discounted food, and 44% have to cut the grocery bills just to make ends meet. A staggering 40% are forced to buy less nutritious food due to cost, while 26% skip meals because they can't afford groceries. That same report now says that 1 in 4 young adults are relying on food banks. The Calgary Food Bank report says that 44% of their users are feeling worse off than they did last year. With so many empty stomachs and families continuing to struggle to get affordable food onto their tables, what is the NDP Liberal government's solution? Why? It's more big government greed. It's higher carbon taxes, more payroll taxes, and more tax on tax. Now, the residents of Calgary Shepherd know that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. And what they want is a common sense Conservative government, and they want it now. A government that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. Let's bring it home, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lac Saint-Louis.
In my riding of Lac Saint-Louis provides a resting place for over 17,000 military service members and their immediate families. It is also a valued space for the community to regularly gather to honour those who have served and fought for Canada. Dimanche prochain, d'anciens combattants.
On Sunday, veterans, families, and many others will gather at the National Field of Honour in the company of the French Ambassador to Canada. Together, they will celebrate the 80th anniversary of D-Day, which was a decisive turning point in the Second World War, made possible by the courageous participation of Canadian soldiers.
I invite any members who may be in the area this Sunday to attend the ceremony. At the same time, it is my hope that the government will soon be able to assume ownership of the Field of Honour and accord it official status as a national military cemetery.
The Honourable Member for Regina, Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal NDP Prime Minister, more Canadians than ever are hungry and homeless. The government recently promised to end chronic homelessness in Canada by 2030. But according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, chronic homelessness is up 38% under the Liberals' watch, and fully 80% of homeless individuals in this country are homeless purely because of affordability reasons. The Parliamentary Budget Officer's findings may come as a surprise to this out-of-touch government, but they come as no surprise to ordinary Canadians. More and more young people are unable to move out of their parents' basements, and those who do often find themselves turning to food banks just to make ends meet. This is the reality after 9 years of the Liberals and their NDP coalition partners. Everything is broken, and we need a new Conservative government to clean up the mess.
The Honourable Member for King Vaughan.
Mr. Speaker, a D-. That is what this NDP Liberal government scored in the 2024 Food Bank Canada report card. A D-. A failing grade. A failing government. Poverty and food insecurity continues to climb. The Dam Food Bank that services 26 municipalities in the GTA reported an increase of 36% visits by seniors. In the month of April, they serviced 60,000 families, a jump from 29,000 in February. This is shameful. Seniors need help. Canadians need help. But this Prime Minister is not listening. If your children came home with a D-, any parent would hold them accountable. This NDP Liberal government needs to be held accountable. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Listen to Canadians, get out of the way, and let Conservatives fix what you have broken. Oh, yeah.
I just need to remind honourable members to run that through the chair, and I feel ashamed. The honourable member for Ottawa West Nepean.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the UN voted to establish the International Day of Reflection and Commemoration of the 1995 genocide in Srebrenica. 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were taken by Serb forces from a UN safe zone, shot and buried in mass graves. After years of painstaking documentation, in 2004 and 2007, international courts ruled that the crimes committed in Srebrenica constitute genocide. 25 years ago, I was working in Sarajevo. Every morning I pass the mothers of Srebrenica, holding photos of their lost sons, begging us for justice. Like one mother who searched all of the mass graves for the red rubber boots that her little boy was wearing on that day. Those faces haunt me still. I hope that by commemorating these atrocities, it will bring some peace and some healing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many youth in Winnipeg Centre face unimaginable hurdles to success. We have among the highest rate of child poverty in the country at almost 40%. But Winnipeg's frontlines organizations are leading the way and rising to this challenge. This includes Resource Assistance for Youth Incorporated, otherwise known as RAY, that provides support services and training programs to youth who are most marginalized by systems, such as the Level Up Education and Work Placement Program, which has empowered 775 youth to join labor markets or post-secondary education. But funding delays by the Liberal government are putting this program at risk, forcing layoffs for 12 staff members and eliminating services for 80 youth at risk. Lives are on the line if we fail to get this funding in our community. All young people deserve opportunities to thrive, and the Liberals must end funding delays and give RAY the resources it needs to empower Winnipeg's youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, Drummond has been on cloud 9 ever since our Voltigeurs won the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League's President's Cup in 4 games in front of ecstatic fans at a packed Centre Marcel Dionne. We were treated to some truly brilliant performances. First, there was the unstoppable goalie, Riley Mercer, who frustrated opponents with his incredible performances throughout the playoffs. Then Voslavod Komarov in the running for the Canadian Hockey League Defenseman of the Year. And then there's Ethan Gauthier, a young player from Drummond, the third member of his family to wear the Rouge uniform after his father Denis and brother Kayland. Ethan was the team's top scorer and second in the entire league. He kept us on the edge of our seats all season, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to be on the edge of our seats thanks to him for a long time, I'm sure. 2024 will go down in Drummondville hockey history forever. The Voltigeurs this weekend will be playing in the Memorial Cup, and this time all of Quebec stands behind them. In Drummond, we are ready to win 2 trophies in a row. Go Voltigeurs, go!
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Food inflation has risen to a 40-year high, and food banks across the country are seeing record demand. Canadians that once donated to their local food banks are now standing in line to receive help. People are skipping meals because they can't afford 3 meals per day. It's a sad, sad story, but this is the record of the sellout NDP leader. Since he joined the Liberal government, life has gotten more expensive. Maybe it's because his brother is a top lobbyist for Metro, or maybe it's because he sold out our farmers and working class Canadians by repeatedly raising taxes on them. Either way, we know the only thing that the NDP leader is looking out for is his own pension. Canadians in southern and northern Ontario, Hamilton, Edmonton, and British Columbia are turning their backs on the NDP and turning towards common sense Conservatives in record numbers. Conservatives represent a return to normal where hard work is rewarded, and not just for those that drive a BMW or wear a Rolex. Conservatives are going to bring it home.
The honourable member for Brampton East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in honor of Nurses Week to recognize and celebrate the incredible contribution of nurses who are true heroes of our medical system. The theme of this year's Nurses Week was changing lives and shaping tomorrow. And this statement is certainly true. Nurses play a critical role in our healthcare system and in the future of our health. They are often the first point for contact for patients, providing compassionate care, emotional support, and expert medical treatment directly impacting their lives. I would like to especially celebrate the incredible nurses of my riding of Brampton East, who are part of the team at Brampton Civic Hospital and medical offices across Brampton, and acknowledge all their hard work and dedication. To all the nurses and healthcare heroes across the country, thank you for your unwavering commitment and service. Your efforts do not go unnoticed, and we are deeply grateful for everything you do to keep our communities healthy. Thank you.
Oral questions, question orale. The honourable member for Haldimand Norfolk.
members, this Liberal NDP government is just not worth the cost of homelessness and hunger that Canadians are facing. Even Canadians who own their own homes are worried that they will become homeless when they have to renew their mortgages at much higher interest rates. Some payments will even triple, according to a new report. When will this government rein in their inflationary spending so more Canadians don't have to worry about homelessness?
Yeah.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's certainly well known that grocery price inflation is a problem that all countries are facing around the world. Grocery price inflation in Canada, there's some good news that just came in with a report that shows that food price inflation is in fact coming down in Canada.